Hello and welcome to Stay and Film, episode 26. I'm your host Dominic Parry, and with today is
Kevin Parry.
And today's episode we're going to be talking about the 1971 film On Any Sunday.
So On Any Sunday was a film really introducing a whole range of motorcycle sport and motorcycle culture. It starred Steve McQueen, whose production company and his own company, Solar Productions, actually funded the film. Apparently it cost $313,000 to produce. In 1971 that was still quite a low budget, and it's one of my all-time favourite films.
Right, well what do you like about it?
Well, being brought up in Britain and obviously with it being made in 1971, I saw it I think in about 1973, and it opened up a whole new world really of just how big the scene of motorcycle culture was in America at the time. It introduced all sorts of different off-road sports that we'd not seen in Britain, all sorts of different aspects of the culture, different names for the events and that sort of thing, and it was really the scope and the range of some of the events which impressed me. So they had the Baja 1000 race, which was racing through the desert, 1,000 miles obviously. They had the Elsinore Grand Prix, which had an entry of 1,500 riders. They had bikes that we didn't see in Britain, and they had forms of motorsport that we hadn't been introduced to.
So this film is probably the most unique film we've done so far, as it is a documentary rather than kind of a feature film. Although it was released in cinema, wasn't it?
It was in cinema, yeah. Since it's been on video and DVD, and it's become something of a cult film, really. Certainly amongst people who are interested in motorcycle culture.
So, did you have an interest in motorbikes before you saw the film?
So when I saw it, I would have had my first 50cc Garelli motorbike, which I used to ride around fields and on the mountain and that sort of thing. And at the time, I guess, I was interested in the whole motorbiking scene, but I hadn't yet really seen how big it was, and obviously the film gave me the appreciation of just how big the scene was in America.
So, for those that don't know, the film kind of follows three main people. We've got Matt, who's trying to kind of retain his number one plate.
Mert Lorwell.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in America at the time, they had the American Motorcycle Association championship of races. So it was road racing, it was long track racing, and flat track. So Mert Lorwell at the time was a works Harley Davidson rider, and he was holding the number one plate from the 1970 season. They followed his sort of efforts during 1971, when it didn't really come good for him. There were lots of younger riders coming in, and I think Mert Lorwell that year didn't enjoy the best of luck, so he had quite a few mechanical breakdowns, and ended up losing the number one plate, which I'm not sure he ever got back. But that was interesting, because certainly the way that they approached motorcycle racing back then, it was basically him and his mechanic in a van, travelling up to 70,000 miles a year, going across states, and just driving through the night and arriving there in time to sort of practice and race the next day. So a very different scene to what it would be now.
So I think one of the interesting things this film does, apart from obviously the cinematography, because this film is shot in a very unique kind of experimental way, I'd say. The film starts off kind of just talking about motorbikes as a whole, and then we go into seeing Mert. But then we cut away to this guy, Malcolm Smith, and it changes from being kind of serious to being more fun and kind of just trying to show you the enjoyment that can be had from a motorbike.
Yeah, yeah, and Malcolm Smith was a very serious businessman. So he had his motorcycle business and also a range of products that he marketed worldwide. But the thing that comes across in the film, I think, is the fun that he had out of his racing, the fact that he was very, very good, and sort of usually won the races that he took part in, probably helped. But he was a product ambassador for Husqvarna, so he was his name became synonymous really with Husqvarna, which was a brand which was really building a big following in the US at the time.
Well, Malcolm Smith himself said that this film, kind of his appearance, really did help him to kind of become a leading entrepreneur in the kind of motorcycle world.
Yeah, I think so. So the two probably helped each other really. He helped to promote the film, and the film certainly promoted his riding and obviously the products that he later brought to market.
So the third kind of main character, I suppose you'd say, is obviously Steve McQueen, famous actor, famous for kind of mainly car-related movies. But obviously he went on to kind of star in some very, very motorbike-based films.
Yes. So I think, as far as I've read, he was chatting to Bruce Brown, the guy who made the film, and Bruce asked him if he'd like to be in the film, and Bruce told him that it was going to be about following motorcycle riders and sort of delving into the motorcycle culture. Steve McQueen said that he was interested, and then Bruce asked him if he would fund it, and his answer was that he's a film star, he doesn't make films, he doesn't fund films, but then Bruce told him, sorry, you won't be able to be in it then. I think Steve McQueen went away and thought about it and thought, actually, yeah, we could put a budget together, a very small budget compared to his other films, like Le Mans, being probably the most famous one that he made, Solar Productions made. So that then set the whole project in motion.
So an interesting thing about Steve McQueen being in the project, so you know the beach at the end, where it's the three of them kind of just having a bit of a ride around.
Yeah.
That was a kind of military facility.
Okay.
And Bruce Brown initially asked for it, and they said no. So then Steve McQueen asked, and they gave it to him. Right.
Okay. Yeah, I think Steve McQueen probably 1971 would have been probably at the height of his popularity, and he'd made a string of very, very successful films. 1971 was the same year that he was involved in making Le Mans, so he was out of the country quite a bit. But certainly he wanted, in the film On Any Sunday, he certainly wanted to be depicted as a serious rider. So the shots where he's taking part in the Elsinore Grand Prix, and of course he took part in the International 6 Days Trial as a teamster for the American team. So he was a very formidable rider. Sometimes had to enter events under a different name because the production companies and Hollywood sort of paymasters didn't want him out there risking life and limb. So he used to enter events under the name Harvey Mushman on his Husqvarna. In fact, one time he had an accident and broke an ankle, which put him out of work for not able to carry on with his work for the Hollywood studio for a couple of months, I think.
Well, there was a line by Bruce Brown, the narrator and director and kind of overseer of the entire project, and he said, like if the Hollywood executives knew what he was doing on the Sundays, then they'd have a fit, essentially.
Yeah.
Not in those words exactly, but kind of seeing Steve McQueen flying around these tracks, inches between him and the other riders. Obviously, the insurance companies wouldn't be too happy if they saw that.
Well, it's an insight into his character as well, I guess, because obviously he was a very happy-go-lucky sort of guy. Um, but he felt most at one when he was on a motorcycle. So when he was engaged in riding a motorcycle fast, there wasn't anything else that could be in his mind really. So I think that comes across in the film also. So I believe that Bruce Brown had previously made a film about surfing, which was called The Endless Summer.
Yeah.
And that's where he sort of cut his teeth. And for me, some of the you mentioned cinematography and the way it was filmed. That came across as quite exciting because they had cameras mounted on the bikes, filming as they were going around the circuits.
Well, they had one of the things they had that hadn't really been done before was helmet cams.
Yeah.
Because obviously 1970s cameras were still very big, so just the idea of like how they shot that, because also you don't see the cameras at any point because it is obviously a film, but the shots they get are probably some of the only kind of shots at that time.
Yeah, and they used the aerial shots as well. So in the Elsinore Grand Prix, they fly over showing Malcolm Smith, passing riders as he's going through a series of corners and going sort of downhill and uphill, and that's quite an interesting thing really. It gives you that overview of the whole event. Also, when they're filming the Baja 1000, the shots of the start of that event, where it's basically it's a shot into the air from a shotgun, but then probably 1,000 riders going off at the same time, gives you a real sort of feel of the scale of the whole event.
Well, they look like ants from the shot they gave. But I think one of the interesting things about the Baja, I think it was when they had this shot and they kind of had that guy and they're like, he's gone off the track, he's lost, no one's seen him, and obviously it's obviously scripted because obviously how can they document it if he's been lost and no one's found him?
Yeah.
And then he sets the bike on fire. It's like the way the filming is done. There's probably a good amount of scripted things in this film, but they just don't come through. Yeah,
well, it showed the bike with a broken chain around the handlebars, so you were to assume that he'd snapped the chain and he was stuck out there in the desert. It was a Husqvarna, so it's likely that Solar Productions. I know that Steve McQueen was very much into Husqvarna motorcycles. Probably bought a number of them in for the filming, and that was one that they just sacrificed as part of the film. Yeah. What came across for me was how it promoted motorcycling as a fun and liberating activity. So something you could do on the weekend with family, something that you could do more seriously as a competitor, but something that you could do just to enjoy yourself, to enjoy the outdoors and the whole process of riding a motorcycle. And it was very much a time when motorcycling was being established as a really big sort of leisure activity.
Well, related to that, Bruce Brown actually thought this film kind of helped to take away the kind of stereotype of riders being bad people.
Yeah.
So obviously, there's a few scenes that kind of tortoise, I think it is. Is it tortoise? It is tortoise, isn't it?
So a desert racer is blasting through the desert, and the tortoise is walking across, and he pulls up his bike, dusts off the tortoise and or turtle actually, and puts it safely away in the bush.
Yeah.
So nobody else is going to run over it.
Bruce Brown has, I think, one of the kind of quotes in the movie, desert racers are good people.
Yeah.
Which, obviously, if you have, because obviously, this is 1971, there were films around that had motorbikes, but obviously they were very much kind of biker gang related. They weren't it wasn't the good guy, usually.
Well, he steered clear of that, didn't he? Because biker gangs were well established by then in America. But I think Bruce Brown stayed away from that and showed motorcycling actually in a good light, and he showed it appealing to a younger audience as well. So kids being involved in it. Showed lots of examples of families being involved and that sort of thing as well. And it was shot at a time, so 1971 was a time when many of the Japanese motorcycle manufacturers were still getting a foothold in the American market. In the film, there are lots of examples of British bikes still being used. So for British bike fans, certainly in the desert racing scenes and the flat track and road racing scenes, Triumph and BSA motorcycles and Matchlesses in the desert races. There's even a shot where a Saracen trials bike is shown, which is quite a small niche sort of manufacturer from the UK, as well as American motorcycles. So Harley Davidson, obviously the Mert Lorwell scenes where he's racing one of those, and then European bikes such as the Husqvarnas, Montesas, Waltacos, and that sort of thing shown in the ISDT. The film actually goes to El Escorial, which is Spain, which I believe was the only time that Spain hosted the event, so the International 6 Days Trial. And you see footage there of a whole range of very different and unusual motorcycles. A lot of them mainly from European and Eastern Bloc countries.
Well, one of the things, well, obviously it's Malcolm Smith we follow there, and he's the guy up to this point. He's been the kind of fun person.
Yeah. So
everyone else has been very serious. He comes along, he's having a great time, and then they kind of show him in a serious light. Yeah. I think he was obviously serious about those aspects of his racing and about his business as well. So Malcolm Smith products still, MSR is still a company which is well known to off-road riders. Malcolm Smith Racing, they still produce clothing and apparel and safety gear for off-road racing. Yeah. I think one of the things that really sets the tone of this film is the On Any Sundays theme song, I guess it'd be, which segments of it play throughout the movie over different scenes, and it doesn't give a kind of really heart racing, kind of really fast, really kind of energetic thing. It's quite a mild 60s to 70s, gentle kind of soulful sort of soulful song. It's what's it like? It's like a jingle from a kind of supermarket advert or something. Right. Okay. Yeah. Rather than kind of obviously if you look at motorbikes now, and motorbike movies or TV, they would usually have kind of metal, heavy metal, kind of rock. Yeah. Because obviously it's like fast, horsepower, kind of manly men, and this film doesn't really do that. Well, no, it's sung. So it's a female vocalist, and it's a very gentle, soulful sort of song, which probably doesn't quite fit the subject matter of the film. No, it does, because it's trying to portray them as the good people. Yeah. And obviously, if you had gone with rock or something, because obviously it's 70s, so there was rock around. Yeah. I think it would have been a completely different movie. Yeah. Well, it's its own quirky sort of film in many ways, isn't it? And that adds to the aspect also. Yeah. So, I don't really have an interest in motorbikes, but this film, it didn't do the kind of classic documentary thing of ignoring the smaller aspects. So it had segments on kind of things like Speedway. No, not Speedway. Speedway's at the start. The drag racing, then the land speed record, and then the sidecar racing. And one of the interesting things it said was, I think there was like around 200 sidecar races in the country, which obviously, if it's a sidecar, there's obviously two people.
It took the viewer as well to places which for we Europeans and for people in Britain, Bonneville Salt Flats, as you mentioned, the land speed record, and Daytona with bikes going around at well over 100 miles an hour. The flat track scenes where they're cornering the bikes at throwing them into a corner at 120 miles an hour. All of those sorts of things, which in Britain we had drag racing, but it was places like Santa Pod, which was a quarter-mile strip. Not at all the same sort of scene as racing a bike at Bonneville, for example. And then they had events like the Widowmaker, which was a hill climb, steep incline, and people developing specially produced motorbikes just to try and beat the hill. So all sorts of quirky things like that probably helped to promote those sports, and probably helped really to make them grow bigger. The other thing that I liked as well was there were BMX scenes at the start, so bicycle motocross, skilled young riders, but the emphasis being on schoolboys being involved with that, and I think that probably did a lot to promote that sport as well, and that took off in Britain, possibly as a result of it being on the screen.
It wasn't just Britain, because apparently it was only in the South in America where the BMX scene was kind of there, and obviously this film was a kind of worldwide film, so it brought it to more of America, and then Europe, and obviously kind of probably Asia in some places.
Yeah.
But it's probably it's quite an unbiased look at things.
And it promotes these leisure activities as things that you can be involved with, enjoying motorcycles. There's no negative aspect to it really. It's all about fun and exploring the great outdoors.
Yeah.
Their laws are different to ours in Britain, and certainly in Britain our laws have changed over time. So we've got less access now to areas for riding, but you can still ride on a weekend. There are sort of motorcycle practice tracks that you can go to, and there are events, scores of events up and down the country for all ages and abilities and all types of motorcycles, notwithstanding lockdown, obviously. But there's plenty out there for people to get involved in, and certainly people of a certain generation will feel that on any Sunday helped to promote that, and it gave the whole sort of scene a bit more of a voice and a bit more of a presence.
Yeah. Well, there's a few crash scenes shown throughout the movie, and a lot of the time they kind of focus on more than one crash scene. Like, it's quite a slapstick approach. However, when one of the kind of competitors for the number one plate crashes off, I'm not sure what his name was, but it goes deadly serious, because obviously he's basically lost his chance of winning, and he comes back with a broken nose and then decides to go on and do the next race anyway, which is obviously a very irresponsible thing to do. But I think it kind of gives this idea that, because it shows Mert as being like, this is his life. It kind of gives this idea that these people are so kind of dedicated that they just can't really say, "Oh, I'll just sit it out now."
Yeah. There's a lot riding on it, obviously, but the people who are injured in the film tend to get up and dust themselves down and carry on, don't they?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's that one guy who turns up already injured with a broken leg. Yeah. Which is quite ridiculous in itself.
Well, he wouldn't be the first person that's been lifted onto a motorbike and competed. probably more a sign of the times, really, because I'm not sure that you get away with that.
No, I don't think you would be allowed.
No. And but it's a sort of it's an insight into a time which has passed, and you know, I mean, a lot of the riders that were featured in the film sadly are no longer with us. Steve McQueen, obviously, one, but quite a few of the others who were the AMA riders are no longer with us. And some of the things that they got away with back then, probably similar to riders in Britain and Europe, you probably wouldn't get away with them now. But that's part of the liberating aspect of the film, perhaps.
Well, one of the big aspects was how kind of Mert basically failed because his bike kept breaking down. And it's kind of the idea that in modern racing, you know, it's not that rider doing their bike like he was, you know, spending, like the thing they said, 1,000 hours a year.
Yeah.
It's now kind of, you have a pit crew, you have a massive team who kind of look after your bike.
If you looked at riders at that level these days, there'd be a team of probably 200 or 300 people.
Yeah.
So he wouldn't be driving in a van with his mechanic, you know, sleeping on the way and eating at roadside snack bars and things. He'd probably be flown everywhere, and you know, a team of mechanics, but not only, you know, general mechanics. These guys would be suspension experts, transmission experts, you know, tyre technicians. So the whole thing has just grown up from what it was back then.
Well, there was the I don't think it was the first race, but they're the one where you kind of go where they said, like, if the gate opens at 8:30, he's there at 8:30.
Yeah.
And then it was like an hour and a half later or something, he's on the track.
Yeah.
It's just
after having driven
70,000,
27 hours or
27 hours, yeah.
Yeah, to get to that race. So that wouldn't happen these days, but it's an interesting sort of you know, comment on how things have progressed and how much more professional things are now. Some of it probably would be seen as a good thing. You know, you don't want to be driving 27 hours and then jump on a bike and ride it 100 miles an hour into the corners. But you know, it's a window of also on a much more naive and sort of a different scene back then.
Well, one of the things said later on in the movie is that scientists had done some like tests and whatnot, and said that motorbike kind of racing. I'm not sure if it was specific, but kind of motorbike. I think, you know, just anything to do with motorbike basically was the second most physically demanding sport, which I'd be interested to see how that kind of stacks up today.
Probably depends on the type of motorcycle sport also, doesn't it? Because certainly international 6 days trial would be very arduous. Trials riding, you know, motocross. It's you know, it's quite physical and all engaging, really.
Well, some of them, they were saying, like, you know, their kind of helmets rattling about, their goggles being pushed into their face and stuff, and obviously with the kind of advanced equipment nowadays, you probably wouldn't have those effects as much.
No, well, Malcolm Smith actually, through his company, Malcolm Smith Products, was one of those people who really pushed the forefront of developing, you know, off-road gear for riders to wear, but also because he was riding in Baja, which was you know, the desert racing. I think you know, he was working with helmet designers and you know, every aspect really, from the gloves to the helmets to the goggles to you know, the sort of the special padded gear and what have you. Every aspect has been looked at and analysed and has developed over the years. So looking back at the film back in 1971, people were riding the bikes with sort of rigger boots on and pairs of, you know, the last scene where they were riding in the dunes, they were riding with jeans on.
Yeah.
You know, well, so things have moved on quite a bit since then.
They were, I'm not sure, I can't remember which one it was. There's a lot of races shown, but it was Steve McQueen, and he's kind of just wearing just basically a top. There wasn't really, it wasn't like armour and stuff like you'd have nowadays. It looked like, if you fell down you were going to be injured. Not kind of like you'd get back up, but they would still get back up.
Yeah. Well, he was well known for being a free spirit. I think there's a couple of very popular images of him riding, sort of bouncing over a jump, and he's wearing a pair of jeans, no top, no helmet, and that sort of thing. In the serious races, obviously, you wouldn't be able to. So you wouldn't be able to start if you didn't have the correct riding gear on. Even in 1971, that would have been the case. But the expectation of the level of safety gear back then would have been much lower. So if you had a helmet, probably any helmet would have done. Whereas now the helmet's got to be up to spec, and it's got to be within date and all that sort of thing.
There was a lot of variations of helmets. So like there are a few people throughout the movie who had kind of like mouth and chin guards.
Yeah.
Like clearly attached onto the helmet, and a lot of them looked kind of added on. They weren't kind of brought with the helmet.
No.
Someone had made this out of some plastic or sheet metal and just stuck it on the front, hoping it'd protect their face if they fell off.
And they used to ride with helmets which were ex Air Force, and they used to ride with canoeing helmets on and stuff like that. They could get away with that sort of thing back then. But fortunately, we're much more safety conscious these days, and any properly organised event, you're expected to have your helmet so it can be inspected, and many events will the bike will be scrutineered, and they make sure that everything's working fine, and it can be as safe as possible. The other thing is the crowd is managed much more effectively. So there were some scenes where people were sort of walking across the street in front of the bikes. In the Elsinore Grand Prix, I remember one scene where you've got people sort of walking across the street while the bikes are flying down the street, and the bikes are doing probably 70 or 80 miles an hour towards them. So that probably wouldn't happen anymore.
Well, I mean, it probably does still happen in some places. Because obviously we've got kind of, when you look at cars and you look at rally, there are people who still run onto the track to take photos and stuff. But it's definitely a bit more tame now, I'd say.
Did you feel that Bruce Brown, in his narration, did you think as a motorcycle person himself? Was he an enthusiast, or was he more of an outsider looking in?
It seemed to be a little bit of both, but he wasn't kind of. I think one of the focuses of this film, he didn't want to kind of bore the watcher, because obviously, if you go on about jargon and stuff, it's just going to kind of alienate people. So I think he could be an avid motorbike rider, or could have been, but I think he took the view and approach of being like a kind of interested outsider, which is what the viewer would be.
Yeah, that came across, didn't it? We were talking earlier about how the film helped to promote the sport, and certainly one thing that I recall is that some of the riders that were taking part in the film were then promoted and came over to Britain. So there was a series of transatlantic races that riders were invited to and paid to come, I think. So we had riders like Gene Romero and Dave Aldana, who came to Britain and drew crowds. So they were pitched up against our riders on our circuits, Brands Hatch and Silverstone and Cadwell Park and places like that. So that certainly brought an interest of the sort of aspect of the American versus our British riders and other European riders also.
Well, Gene Romero, who, if I'm not wrong, won the kind of number one plate at the end. One of the strange things was when they had him in one of the last shots of him, he had a Union Jack on his outfit.
Oh right.
So
he was riding for BSA, I think, at the time.
So obviously, the kind of, it's all American, apart from when you go to the the Spaniards and stuff. You've got kind of, I think it was the Dutch, was the top riders, and it's just it's a different scene, all just completely.
Well, back in those days, the American market. For the British manufacturers, BSA, Triumph, Norton, all of those manufacturers were shown in the film, and Matchless and lots of other sort of smaller companies as well. I mentioned Saracen was seen there. It was a massive market, and certainly the off-road scene, the leisure market, the off-road sort of riding competition, leisure riding, trail riding, that sort of thing, was seen by the British manufacturers as a massive thing. So it was a big slice of their market, and at the time, of course, 1971, probably the British motorcycle manufacturing industry was at its height. So they were shipping hundreds and hundreds of bikes over there every year. The Japanese invasion was really in its infancy. So it showed Suzuki Works bikes being used in motocross, but it hadn't really taken hold as it did later on. So as the 70s progressed, there was a huge change in motorcycle manufacturers and motorcycle design. There was a big drive forward in technology. So the bikes that we saw in the film 1971. By the end of the 70s, 1979, 1980, motorcycles had changed completely. So they were high travel suspension, far more powerful engines, better brakes. You had disc brakes coming in, and then shortly into the 80s, pretty much the chassis design changed altogether. So went to a single shock absorber on the back, and everything changed with air-cooled engines being phased out and water-cooled ones being brought in.
So, what would you kind of overall, what would you give this film out of 10?
Well, it depends how you're sort of judging it, really. I mean, just as a feel-good film, which informs people about motorcycles and the culture of motorcycles and the enjoyment that can be found riding motorcycles, preparing them, and all that sort of thing, I'd give it a 9 out of 10. But it's difficult because you can't compare it with feature films and all the other sort of genres of films that there are. But for me, 9 out of 10.
I think as someone who isn't interested in motorbikes kind of initially, I think the kind of, just as a documentary, it definitely did its job very well.
Yeah.
So I didn't feel really bored at any point. I was interested throughout the entire thing, and I think because of that I have to give it a 9 as well, just because it was an interesting look into the motorbike scene, and it didn't just kind of fill you up with jargon and names of people you're never going to remember.
Yeah.
It was focused, and it was quite quite positive for all of it.
Yeah.
And I think that was quite a refreshing thing to see in a documentary kind of thing.
So there we go. 9 out of 10 for On Any Sunday. If there's anybody out there who hasn't seen it, it's on YouTube.
Yeah.
And it's well worth a look. If you don't know much about motorcycle racing or the motorcycle culture, it'll give you an insight into it, and it'll take you back to a time back in 1971 where things were quite different.
Now, there are also a few sequels. One which is kind of more honorary sequel than anything. And then there's 3, I think it is, by Dana Brown, so Bruce Brown's son.
Okay.
And, potentially might do one of those later date. But hope you enjoyed this episode. Go watch the other episodes. And see you next week.
Thank you.